We're going to finish our conference with a bit of a bang. We've got some tremendous speakers, highly respected in the customs community this morning. And I'd like to start by introducing Assistant Secretary Dr. Alan Bersin. Dr. Alan Bersin commenced service as Assistant Secretary of International Affairs and Chief Diplomatic Officer for the Department of Homeland Security in January 2012. And in that capacity, he oversees the department's international engagement and serves as a principal advisor to the Secretary of Homeland Security on all international affairs. And previously, Dr. Bersin served as Commissioner of US Customs and Border Protection, where he oversaw the operations of CBP's 57,000 employee workforce and managed an operating budget of more than $11 billion geared to protecting the nation's borders from all threats while expediting lawful trade and travel. In 2009, Alan Bersin served as Assistant Secretary and Special Representative for Border Affairs in the Department of Homeland Security. In that capacity, he served as Secretary Napolitano's lead representative on border affairs and strategy regarding security, immigration, narcotics and trade matters, as well as for coordinating the Secretary's security initiatives on the nation's borders. Now, other professional experience includes employment as Special Counsel to the Los Angeles Police Commission, a visiting Professor of Law at the University of San Diego School of Law, as an Adjunct Professor of Law at Bolt Hall, University of California, Berkeley, and at the University of Southern California Law Center, and as a lecturer at the Stanford University Graduate School of Education. Dr. Bersin served as a member of the Board of Overseers for Harvard University from 2004 to 2010, and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Pacific Council on International Policy. He was awarded the degree of Doctor of Laws Honorary by the University of San Diego in 1994, by California Western School of Law in 1996, and by the Thomas Jefferson School of Law in 2000. So this morning, Dr. Bersin is going to talk to us about lines and flows, the beginning and end of borders, a theory of action for border management and security in a global age. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bersin.
Salam alaikum, salam, bonjour, buenos dias, good morning everyone. And what a spectacular day in Baku. Bakuda, the windy city. We've felt the wonderful winds of Baku, but also have an opportunity today to see it in its splendor, a jewel here on the Caspian. I want to start by saluting the State Customs Committee of Azerbaijan and its chairman, Ivan Aliyev, a true visionary and leader in our field, and it is altogether fitting and proper that we are here in Baku to discuss the implementation of what is in fact a revolution in our world from the Doha round of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, that led to the Bali Accord that is the subject of this conference. It is also a tribute to the international network of customs universities to whom you belong, formally, directly or indirectly, and it is a tribute to David Widdowson and his team at Charles Sturt University and at the universities affiliated around the world for having taken up this issue. The notion that the customs occupation can be a profession with standards and professional norms requires the kind of academic research that, in fact, INCU stands for and Professor Witterson has pioneered. And it is altogether timely that we do that at this juncture. Think about the prospect, and this is a tribute to Chairman Aliyev and to his colleagues at the State Customs Committee here in Azerbaijan, to have 3 Nobel laureates attend what in the past would have been thought as a customs conference. Think about the implications of declaring that the customs and border management roles and responsibilities require thinking at the highest level, and you embodied that by inviting Sir Christopher, Professor Sargent, and Professor Roth. And we learned from those 3 gentlemen, in fact, that genius resides in simplicity. How, in fact, simple propositions give rise to many other thoughts that require us to review the bidding, so to speak, and understand where we are and where we are going. The notion of the customs union and the single market and the problems of the Eurozone, someone might say, why does that have to do with Bali? The notion of monopoly costing and being inefficient, how does that relate to the Bali Accords and trade facilitation, let alone the processing of goods across a frontier? And lastly, Professor Roth's discussion of repugnant transactions and prohibited markets again raised the question. But all of us can draw certain lines from those ingenious observations to our daily lives and our professional responsibilities. But what INCU and what David Witterson and Ivan Aliyev have said is, we need to understand that there is much work to do in the aftermath of Bali. And yes, indeed, as the French poet Paul Valéry said, the challenge of our times is that the future is not what it used to be. The challenge of our times is that the future is not what it used to be. And that requires the kind of innovation and the kinds of courage that are called for from leaders like yourselves at times of transition and change. And in fact, this conference, this inaugural conference, will stand for the proposition that we need to develop new ways of seeing as a prelude to new ways of doing. Those who fear the future will not be able to take advantage of it. Those who resist the future will, in Trotsky's memorable phrase, be lifted onto the garbage heap of history and be swept away into the dustbin of history. Those who come to a turning point, ladies and gentlemen, and do not turn are left behind by history. And we are in such a time today in the context of cross-border trade and the management of our border responsibilities. So what I would like to do today is very directly confront at least 2 or 3 of the major ways in which I think we have to stop thinking in one vein and start adopting new ways of seeing, and then with the help of INCU, over the course of the next generation, work toward principles and standards and intellectual frameworks that can handle the new circumstances in which we live. Let me give you a quick overview of what I will spend the next 30 minutes on and observe my 45-minute deadline. The way in which the context in which we operate has changed. And thanks to INCU, you should have a copy of an article that the World Customs Journal published a couple of years ago entitled Lines and Flows, the Beginning and the End of Borders. What I would like to explore with you is the changes in the context of what borders are and how they confront us with new challenges. And then what I would like to do is very summarily go through the Bali Accords, but then focus on what I think are the two key provisions for us to start. Not that the others aren't important, but the two that require us to change our paradigms, change the way we think, actually is contained in Article 7 that has to do with risk management, and Article 8 that talks about collaborative border management. And I will focus on those and then come back to a task that I think is before us in INCU. So let's begin with the central challenge that we have, as we all represent customs or other border authorities that are based on the nation state, on the 17th century Westphalian system that divided the world into demarcated sovereignties, at one point in history, empires, at another point in history, nation states that remain the basic framework in which we operate. So that when we cross from Azerbaijan into across one of the 7 borders in which it coexists, we go from one sovereignty to another sovereignty. And we begin to adjust to different regimes of administration and standards, requirements, regulations, and laws. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, that framework, which still governs the way in which we see ourselves juridically, the way in which the world is organized to conduct business, is almost completely antithetical to the nature of the contemporary global world. This slide depicts the flows of goods and the road networks in the maritime alone. But if you think about the flows of goods and people and ideas and electrons and images and capital and labor, you begin to see that that is what, in its total picture, is what globalization is all about. It is increasing the speed and intensity and the volume, the quantity of goods, people, images, ideas, capital, labor, that flow without very much regard for border lines, which are the traditional ways in which we define our authorities and the ways in which we operate in terms of our customs, immigration, agricultural inspection, every virtue and every vice of regulation exercises itself at the border. We consider our border lines the first line of defense in protection of our sovereignty. What I want to argue today, and what is contained in the article provided by the World Customs Journal and INCU, is that in a world in which globalization characterizes the way in which we move and the way in which we transact business, we must begin to see borders as being flows as much as they are lines. And we must see our job as regulating those flows and understanding that those flows have turned our business into one that is essentially irrevocably transnational in nature. We cannot see our border lines as places in which we fortify and we hunker down and we wait for something to come to cross into our countries, and then we apply rules and regulations. Instead, we must adapt, as a matter of paradigm, a much more dynamic view of our borders as being the places toward which flows, increasingly rapid in speed and increased volume, are moving toward us. The question that we have is, how do we operate in this new world? So when we get to the Bali Accords, we have the World Trade Organization correctly observing that in a globalized world, handling those flows in modern ways is essential to economic prosperity of all of our countries and of the globe as a whole. But the question is, how do we do it? How do we think about it? And then how do we develop regimes and capacity to be able to execute it with fidelity to the objective? And so the Bali Accords take us through a series of principles that appear on the screen before you and that we need to familiarize ourselves with. And then it gets on to Article 7, having to do with the release and the clearance of goods. And it contains the critical notion of risk management systems focused on targeting high-risk consignments and expediting low-risk consignments. And the reason that it focuses on that as the essence of trade facilitation is that it is the movement. What I want to discuss with you this morning is, how does that require us to think differently about the way in which we conduct our duties? And then Article 8, the implications of all of these changed ways of seeing in terms of cooperative border management and cooperation between authorities operating in the Westphalian framework. So we'll focus on Articles 7 and 8, but Articles 9 through 12 talk about some of the mechanics of achieving facilitated trade flow in terms of single windows and reduction of documentation, or what Jan Huffman would call red tape, and the outreach to private sector and cooperation on training each other for the new world. And then Article 13 talks about the institutionalization. But let me come back to Articles 7 and 8 and talk about the paradigm changes that I think are involved here. Because the challenge of our times fundamentally is that we deal with these massive flows, but 98% of those flows are entirely legitimate and lawful, and we are concerned with 2% or less of the flows. And the question is, how do we find the needle in a haystack? So the first proposition that I think we need to come to grips with and build into the DNA of our thinking and our practice is that the old dichotomy between security and trade facilitation actually is a false dichotomy. In the past, ladies and gentlemen, we thought that trade and security are mutually exclusive variables, so that if you wanted to increase the facilitation of trade, by definition, you needed to lower the security that you paid attention to in processing the flow of goods. We thought that they are two different variables and that one needed to be sacrificed in order to achieve the other. And that when you made gains in one, by definition, in a zero-sum game, you had losses in the other. What we learn and what we must build into our thinking is that they are not, in fact, two different processes, but properly implemented, they are the same. So if we are looking for a needle in a haystack, there are three ways that I've been able to find that you can succeed in that task. The first is to actually look at every piece of straw. And in fact, after the devastating trauma of 9/11 in my country, the first reaction was precisely that. We essentially shut down the borders, stopped the movement of airlines into the country, diverting flights to Canada. We opened up at our land borders with Mexico and Canada, we opened up every trunk of every vehicle, with the result that the line stretched north into Canada for 18 miles, and the line stretched south into Mexico for more than 20 miles. And within 2 days, we realized that if we were to actually continue to look for a needle in a haystack by looking at every piece of straw, that we would have delivered a victory to those terrorists that sought to shut down modern society and the operation of contemporary trade. So looking at every piece of straw is not a very efficient or sensible way to find the needle in a haystack. The second way is actually to have very specific information or intelligence that permits you to reach into the haystack because you know where the needle is and you actually pluck it out efficiently. And that is in fact what happened in October 2010 when Saudi Arabian authorities alerted U.S. authorities in the intelligence community that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had placed PETN explosives in printer cartridges that were addressed to synagogues in Chicago with the intention of blowing up the FedEx and the UPS plane before it reached its destination. As a result of the Saudi Arabian intelligence information, working with the private sector and with governments in the Arabian Gulf and in Europe, we were able to find the two packages amidst the millions of packages in the global supply chain and reach in and pluck them out and prevent the terrorist activity. While information exchange among sovereign governments is improving, the fact is that you cannot routinely rely on intelligence information to find a needle in a haystack. Which brings me to the third manner of more effectively finding needles in haystacks, or the low or the high risk cargo amidst the flow of perfectly lawful trade and travel. And that is by making the haystack smaller, by shrinking the haystack. And this is the central principle of risk management and why we cannot do our jobs today without engaging in risk management systems that permit us to separate out high risk from low risk trade and expedite the movement of lawful trade through our processes in a way that reduces the haystack and permits us to focus our attention, our resources of inspection and control on those goods about which we have derogatory information such that we classify them as high risk, or we don't have any information at all or insufficient information to make a judgment that they are low risk and can be expedited. And when we focus our attention on the high risk cargo, we actually increase the security regime because we can focus our limited resources on the high risk goods and not devote them to the vast majority of lawful trade about which we have no concern. It is in that sense that we see that trade facilitation and security are not antithetical. They are not two different processes. They're actually the same process, and that when we move lawful traffic and expedite lawful cargo through our process, we are actually increasing the security profile at the same time that we are increasing trade facilitation. So as we develop an implementation of the Bali Accords, we must actually see flows and securing flows toward our jurisdictional lines as requiring risk management. It is a corollary of that makes authorized economic operator programs absolutely essential. The AEO program that identifies trusted cargo and trusted shippers, trusted importers and exporters are key to us being able to make assessments that they are low risk and therefore can be expedited through the system so that we can focus our limited resources on the high-risk cargo and the high-risk shippers, or again, those about which we lack sufficient information to make a judgment. Making the haystack smaller requires us to engage in risk management, and risk management requires us to have authorized economic operator programs, and it requires targeting. The notion of targeting is something we must again build into our DNA. Targeting is not a dirty word. Targeting is the key to being able to segment traffic. And the question is, how do we engage in targeting in a way that is constructive? I just list up here for your benefit a whole series of authorized economic operator programs and the ways in which we can actually engage in the segmentation of traffic and begin to achieve security of trade, which moves quickly when it is judged to be of low risk. In fact, I would submit and ask Chairman Aliyev, in his capacity as chairman of the WCO European Council, and Dr. Witterson as the leader of our INCU endeavor, I submit to you that the term trade facilitation is no longer a useful one. It expresses a concept that suggests something we must actually educate the WTO about. Trade facilitation is deeply about securing flows of goods and people. It's not simply facilitating the trade. So what we should be thinking about, and part of the intellectual reconstruction of our profession, requires that we find terminology that better expresses what we seek. And I don't have a term to commend to you today, but would ask that all of us think about how we characterize securing flows and expediting low risk, how we begin to characterize that so that we ourselves express what it is we are seeking to accomplish. So the first proposition I've offered to you is that security and trade facilitation, securing flows of goods and people, are not two processes, but one. The key to the process of risk management and making this work is actually metadata and big data. You cannot do risk assessment absent the kind of data that permits us to reach with some certainty the degrees of low risk and high risk. Now, absent perfect data, which we never have perfect data, we make judgments all the time. So I'm not suggesting that we don't have to make judgments, but the more information that we make those judgments on, the more precise and accurate those judgments will be in terms of the risk of the cargo that we're dealing with. Data in and of itself is not confidential. Information is confidential. Data is data. Making data into usable information that we can act on is our task in the risk management system. Developing algorithms that sort through vast amounts of data will give us more usable information that permits us then to make judgments about risks. So the second proposition is that we should not be afraid of big data. Ladies and gentlemen, metadata, big data is with us whether we like it or not. We make medical decisions and medical research based on metadata. We make consumer marketing decisions based on metadata. The way in which all of our clients in the business world operate is with big data. We need to do it, and we need to lead the way in creating the global data mart that would permit us to actually make judgments about the risk of cargo. And ladies and gentlemen, this is another big point that we have to come to grips with, and we have to rethink the way we have seen the world. Information is power. Our mothers, our fathers, our family members, our teachers taught us that very early on. Information is power, and it is still power. But the lesson of the past is no longer useful, because when we used to say information is power, the lesson that we derive from it is that we should hoard the information and not share it. That if we held the information, it was of value to us because in exchange for giving it to someone else, we could extract something of value in return for getting the information. I will give you this information if you give me this or that. Information remains power. But in a world of globalized trade and travel and instantaneous communication and digitized transfer of data, the key to power and information is that you share it. Because if you share the information, it permits you to bounce off against other people's data, your data, which permits you to connect the dots and build information that is much more valuable than those who hold information and hoard it. And those who do so in the future will be overcome, isolated, and no longer relevant. Because in fact, in a world online, in a world of cyberspace, those who share information will be the beneficiaries of turning data into usable information. We cannot be afraid of it, and we should not let old views actually prevent us from sharing data. And here we usually say to ourselves and are told by others that we cannot share information because it violates this or that concern about data protection or privacy. And with all due respect to my European colleagues here, I sometimes get the view that Europeans think they have a monopoly on concerns over privacy. I should actually point out to you that the modern notion of privacy was invented by Justice Louis Brandeis in the late 19th century. And all of us care about privacy, and all of us care about protecting the space around us and our families. But the way in which information can be shared today, or data can be shared, is not according to the old model. The old model of information sharing was that I put all of my information into a database or into a dump truck, and I carried that data over to you, and I dumped it into your database or into your backyard, and that you could then go through that information. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not the way that data sharing operates today. It is not taking a crate of information and handing it to you and saying, give me your information in exchange. Federated computer searches permit the scanning and the review of vast amounts of data in a completely masked fashion, that is, without the identity of whose data is being scanned. And the only time that you actually look at the underlying identifying features is when there is a match, when there is a hit, when there is an alert. And then, according to very specific protocols that we need to develop among ourselves, we would then exchange specific information about why is that cargo high risk? Why is that shipper not to be trusted? Why is this particular flow something of concern? But only then, when there is a hit and a match, would we be required to actually identify specific people or cargo or things. Information is power, and we must learn to share it, and we can do it in a way that is completely consistent with our national, personal, and universal views about privacy of person and family. Third proposition I offer you is that although we operate in a Westphalian world, we cannot see ourselves as operating in isolation. Our work is inherently transnational. We've always known that. Azerbaijan with 7 borders, one of which is a hostile border. We must actually learn to work with our brother and sister agencies according to rules that permit us to do business in a way that is both secure and that expedites lawful trade and travel. Let me give you an instance of why and how this operates and makes us inherently transnational in our work and therefore in our thinking. When Umar Abdul Muttalib got on a plane in Africa and flew to Schiphol, his intention was to blow up the Detroit, the airliner, Northwest airliner heading to Detroit, and he intended to do that over American and Canadian airspace. Customs and Border Protection, which I was heading up at that time, had actually identified Abdul Muttalib as a person of interest who would have been taken into secondary and asked further questions. as we would often do with a cargo. We realized that our system of looking at borders as the first line of defense would not have succeeded, and in fact, even though we would have taken him into a secondary inspection in Detroit, he would have completed the terrorist act because he would have blown up the airplane before he got to Detroit. What that demonstrated was that we needed to be working before the passengers actually get to the port of entry, and that the port of entry is the last line of defense. The same is true with regard to cargo. We cannot do our work without engaging in partnerships, certainly with our foreign partners, and I would submit also with the private sector. We cannot operate in isolation. We must share the information and develop with foreign partners the ways in which we are going to manage our borders. We must understand, with regard to border, is that we must move from binational, we must move toward binational from bilateral operations at the border. Any border is a joint operation. And we must, in a world in which we see borders as flows, develop relationships cross-border that provide both security and expedited flow. The last proposition that I offer you, that we must begin to rethink the way in which we operate, is our relationship with the private sector. Now, I found Sinya Costco and Richard Morton, Jan Hoffman, Alan Long, Alan Hall actually started to provide us with the nuts and bolts methods in which we bring the private sector into the operation of our border management schemes. And we must do that. And we must do that at scale. And whether it's port community systems or some other public-private partnership, that is the way of the future. But let me give you an even more dramatic example of why we must stop seeing ourselves as being those who hand down regulations and regimes of rules, but rather we must see ourselves as co-creating with the private sector the new regulatory systems that will govern the securing of flows and goods toward jurisdictional borders and lines. In 2010, when those printer cartridges with PETN explosives were on their way toward Chicago, we realized that we needed, again, as we did with travel in the aftermath of Abdul Muttalib, we needed to see ourselves as being engaged way before the cargoes got to our ports of entry. We began to think about creating a system in which we could enlist time and space as our allies in securing flows, and we realized that we could not do that without the private sector. 80% of air cargo is handled by the express carriers today. DHL, FedEx, UPS, whole variety of international carriers. They account for 80+% of all air cargo. And when you ask one of them, and they have data systems that are far better than ours. They track cargo and know their customers in ways that we can never know, because that is their bread and butter, so to speak. And yet we deal with them as though we are operating as passing ships in the night, as opposed to co-creating systems in which they can give us the information ahead of time, and we can, in effect, pre-clear the large majority of their cargo, and then, in effect, having expedited the cargo about which we know what we need to know, we can focus with their help on the needles in the haystack that become more apparent. So the lesson there, ladies and gentlemen, is do not see the private sector as them versus us. We are government, and we have responsibilities to our peoples, and we will observe that line. But we must get away from the notion that we cannot build systems that permit us to deal with global flows much more efficiently than we have in the past. So let me end where I began. We stand at the brink of a new age. We, in our hands and in our minds, and with the help of INCU and leaders such as Aliyev and Widdowson, we will actually find a way to deal with the global flows to which we are now inextricably linked. I submit to you that the next job of INCU, and perhaps at our next conference, we should begin to develop the charters that will enunciate the principles of many of the elements we have looked at this morning. This is just a draft. In fact, I won't go through any of it except to say it starts off with generic principles. Then it says how governments might think about organizing themselves. That's us. What governments should do together. What individuals can expect from the government. And what the private sector can expect. And having developed these principles and practices, we will begin to, in the terms of the conference title, put policy into practice according to principles that we all debate and then agree upon as the way in which we can proceed in a world in which the future is not what it used to be. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very much.
Well, thank you very much for those insightful thoughts. Dr. Bersin has put to us a number of extremely well-constructed principles and propositions and challenges. And the future is indeed not what it used to be. We've heard from Dr. Bersin that there needs to be new thinking, and that needs to be built into our DNA. And I really like the expression that he used, that there's a need for intellectual reconstruction of our profession, which hopefully is what INCU is seeking to achieve and gradually achieving. So indeed, it's been an absolute pleasure to be here to listen to that firsthand. Please join me in thanking Dr. Bersin.